A very beautiful community. Let me know if you can see and hear me. It's lovely to be with you. It feels a little bit strange, I must say, because I've had quite a difficult, sort of violent, sort of 20 hours of health sort of thing where you don't know what's happening next. You just sort of wait now, then moment by moment, the next 30 seconds. With my microvascular damage, just feels like feeling of drowning. And I'm out of that the last few hours, and so it's a delight to do a live. But this feels a bit like being at sea and suddenly being awash on the beach, and people are here and they are going a little bit around, and they have little floaty devices, and it's all nice and normal. So it's very lovely to see you. Now, you might say, well, no, our political world isn't looking very normal, but there you go. So I just want to say how strange, in a nice way, it is to see you all. Let's have a little bit of feedback about whether you can hear me. Yeah, good, you can hear me. So I love doing this kind of honor and centering of folks who've left comments at the top. I notice I haven't done it the last couple of times. So let's try to go up and see, and then we'll reconnect with all of us as we are commenting and trying to make sense of the world. Piotr is saying, do you think Trump's actions affect the chances of politicians like him getting into power in Europe? So there is a kind of a question of domino theory, right? Two ways. That is, are there going to be more post-truth populists coming to power in Europe just because there is one in America? And it's not really a domino theory, but tendentiously I'd recommend to think yes. And then an even bigger issue is, what if in 2037 US democracy becomes Hungary and collapses? How would that affect Europe? And my answer is to unfortunately recommend the big domino theory expectation. The sustenance of European democracy is very heavily culturally predicated on the sustenance of American democracy. So the answer is yes. Obviously, domino theory is a silly term, but yes, I'm a domino theory advocate in terms of how the winds kind of impact us that are coming from the United States. Leonid is saying, is American repositioning against Europe part of a longer term beginning and not a random fluke or a negotiating tactic? Looks like Musk and Thiel want Europe gone as an alternative center of the free world. So the specific antics of the Trump administration are temporary, and they will lead in many ways nowhere, and many implosions will occur within Trump world. Having said that, independently of Trump, there is a very significant global reset. So it's not the case that if you just get rid of Trump, the sort of self-directed rearrangement by the United States of its role in the world is going to revert back to what it was. No, these are big historic changes, and Trump is just a sort of erratic accelerator of them. So no, I would say that we have to keep the two apart and say that there are some ways in which Trump is a version of normal. In other words, he's a version of the currents that we're floating in. And if you take Trump away, other actors will reconstitute somewhat similar currents. Rune, on Thursday, reports stated that two disagreements in Trump's cabinet broke out, which he legislated by giving half-baked suggestions. Do you think he is deliberately emulating Putin? Do you mean at the level of presiding over conflicts in his clan, which he arbitrates? I might not understand your question. If that is the question, then not really. Trump does not have any leadership skills and doesn't carry anybody. and there are going to be breaks for different reasons. One of them being that fractures in the Trump team. Um, one being that there are so many grifters and entrepreneurs there. I mean, just look at Marco Rubio, who is spectacularly unconvinced of Trump's politics on the global stage, but he's playing along because of careerism. So Rubio is not somebody who's kind of convinced himself he's doing the right thing. He might have convinced himself that he is the least worst person to be there because he can, if anything, soften Trump a bit. But that's a delusion. So we're going to see implosions in Trump's team, and it's still possible to have a big implosion between Musk and Trump in a few months. Anon Emmaus is asking, do you think the threat of nuclear proliferation in countries like Poland, Turkey, South Korea, and Japan could make Trump reconsider his isolationism? No. But nuclear proliferation is what we should expect. We should expect a bit of a rush toward the long journey of acquisition of nuclear weapons by many countries. That's the kind of world we are in, and Trump is again not a cause of that, but he is an accelerator of it. Let's take one more. Zonko is saying, Vlad's analysis of the Zelensky Oval Office drama was some of the best out there. Sorry to read praise. The unsubscribers are missing out. I noticed the War on the Rocks podcast also got some similar pushback. So I hadn't had the chance to listen to the wonderful War on the Rocks guys. Super recommended, of course, for top military analysis. I was struggling with three things. First of all, just being profoundly ill, and that sometimes means it's sort of hard to strike a perfect balance in managing the community. Second, I think I discovered that I don't actually have a style of my own when it comes to comments. I have a style of my own, clearly, when it comes to interaction with you on screen. But I have an issue with comments in the sense that I haven't thought through deeply enough how I handle them. I only really had one principle before, which is to say 90% of the time I should respond in a sort of gentle and elevating way. And 10% it's okay to respond. 10% of the time it's okay to respond in a kind of casual, off-handed, off and abrupt way. So if somebody says, that up is down, 9 out of 10, if I am replying, I'd say, look, actually, down is up. No. You see, I've got myself lost here. Actually, up is up and down is down. And I think it's really important that we grasp that. That's going to be my response 9 times out of 10. But 10% of the time, I allow myself to say, that's ridiculous and you're flat wrong. And it's important that can happen sometimes because it's just human. But it's also important to strike the right balance. And so I need to add another stylistic element now to the way I handle comments. And that, I think, is just about discouraging algorithmic drift in us, but also being gentle enough to not feel like I'm responding in a tough way that punishes the really important free association aspect of making comments and thinking on the spot as you make comments. So a bit of growth there. And then the third thing I was really balancing is how to not allow a part of the community to gaslight another part of the community. And of course, it's in this regard that I make a big distinction between, on the one hand, saying something about that Oval Office meeting, which is perhaps like the thought that Zelensky couldn't have done any better, and saying something like that nobody should discuss ways in which Zelensky could have done better. We shouldn't talk about it. How would you? How could you? Why did you? talk about it. And of course, if you look at the activist channels in our niche, a lot of them had super popular comments saying Zelensky handled it brilliantly, couldn't have handled it any better. Of course, we are an analytical channel, but for goodness sake, we have had a very pro-Ukrainian position here. And, if I weren't a philosopher, I would have obviously more issues balancing my biases, which I don't feel I do. I've never struggled with that personally. I've never worried about that. But if I weren't a philosopher, I'd probably be at risk of some kind of pro-Ukrainian bias. And moreover, all of you know that we do analysis here, that, if aliens invaded Earth and some political leader, did a press conference, I am genuinely capable of coming out with a chat that says, Leader X failed to do 3 things in the speech and didn't give a clear enough vision of America. Vlad, aliens are invading. What kind of analysis of vision for America in the speech are you talking about? Aliens are invading. And I am still, well, no, I think you're going to analyze the speech. This is about politics, getting the political in politics. So that's also just, of course, part of what we do. It's quite natural for me to break down different things Zelensky could have done differently to handle the really unlovely, difficult ambush that he experienced. And I think it's also just really important just to ground us and say, look, really difficult time. For a lot of people are waking up at night. And, on top of that, it's hard to witness a leader fighting for his country in that difficult dynamic in the Oval Office. And it was sort of, earth-shatteringly hard for Zelensky. It's really the ground is shaking beneath you when that kind of interaction happens. At the same time, I did have a responsibility to a part of my audience to express my view that not wanting to talk about what Zelensky could have done better, or feeling that there's nothing he could have done better at all, is a dangerous view in the context of a sort of a free and open and analytical conversation. And it's the danger there is what I call, and it's not scary to say, it's the psychotic danger. And the psychotic danger is simply a danger we all experience, which is that we want to cancel bits of reality that are challenging, we don't want to go into, because it's a hard world to deal with. So it's not to say that we have a psychotic thought. It's not to say that we've gone crazy in some way, and, the people who were saying, Vlad, why would you, how could you criticize Zelensky's performance? I thought that they were talking from a position of sincerity. And also, I don't believe that the problem with positions like Zelensky couldn't have done anything better is a lack of intelligence. It's rather algorithm capture. And I think there's a lot of people making that comment and making the case very intelligently for it, even though it's so implausible, right? Because, of course, you can talk about what he could have done better. You can say 77 things he could have done better. That's compatible with blaming the whole thing on Vance and Trump. It's compatible with saying wouldn't have made a big political difference for Ukraine. You can still talk about it. So that was the sort of mosaic of balances I wanted to handle. Enough. Sorry, I've bombarded you with such a big rant on this. Suzanne, thank you so much. Sorry that I'm struggling a little bit at the moment with air hunger. If you can hear that, that's just life. Let's have a look. Mario is saying, I fear that Randian objectivism will be the dominant ideology of the 21st century, just as Marxism was for the 20th, with Peter Thiel and Elon Musk as Lenin and Stalin as Ayn Rand and Marx. So the attack on the US civil service by part of the Trump administration can rightly be seen as Leninist, in the sense of a vanguard trying to make a political change, not in the sense of communism, and ideological in the sense that there is a lot of scientism there. Scientism says we can reduce political life and political values to very simple notions like efficiency. And a lot of sort of neoliberalism there, which says, you can run a government like you can run a corporation, but you can't. So this kind of infantilized, scientistic, market fancying Leninism is what you are seeing expressing itself in the form of an attack on, part of the, uh, you know, counter-majoritarian institutions in the United States. It's a concern, and how far we worry about it is back to the analogy of the Titanic. How many compartments can you have? How many compartments can you have flooding? Let's have a look. Nicholas, thank you. Elsie, thank you. Marina, thank you. Dave, thank you. Rachel, I'm not sure what I can say about Iran at this point, but we might come back to it. Michael, how do you weigh nuclear escalation risk versus justifiable diplomatic isolation of Russia? Does any risk disproportionately negatively affect Ukraine? So, one of the main reasons Ukraine didn't get as much help as it otherwise would have done in 2022, 2023 is fear of nuclear war by the Biden administration. What I would say today is that the biggest risk we've got is not support for Ukraine, obviously, because the Trump administration is abandoning Ukraine. But the unpredictability Trump is introducing into the world, when Article 5 is, semi-collapsed and uncertain, actors on the global stage don't know where they stand. And that dissolution of clarity, that further melting down of the global security arrangements does dramatically increase nuclear risk. And I'm afraid that Trump, just through the unpredictability of his discourse, if nothing else, has increased the unpredictability of the world and therefore nuclear risk. Increased scenarios that countries think they can get away with something because they miscalculate the way the layout of power dynamics is, the state of the collapse of the security arrangements, how far gone is it, and so on. So Trump's introducing a lot of uncertainty. And that increases nuclear risk, I'm afraid. Anders Nielsen did a very good video on this a few weeks ago on his channel. Now, in terms of nuclear risk of supporting Ukraine, the United States took the view that anything like Ukraine potentially taking Crimea would be a significant risk of nuclear war in 2022, 2023, and acted accordingly. Now, what you can say is that ethically, whatever is your strategy, if you're a responsible president of the United States, of course, you always weigh nuclear risk, because a lot of politics has to be done negatively, and the biggest negative evil, the biggest negative thing to avoid, is a situation where civilization ends. Much more on that perhaps another time. It's a very important topic, especially as we're going to see a race for the acquisition of nuclear weapons by different countries. Gerald, Vlad, what do you think about the promise of technology in solving some of our material limitations, stuff like biotech, material science, and so on? Well, it depends on how far you want to go with that, right? What I don't believe in is fundamentally in technology solving core political problems we have, right? So there will always be political conflict. There will always be a social and political reality behind any technology. What government owns it? Can it collapse? What company owns it and runs it? Can that collapse? Right? Um, that's why there is a kind of a spectacular naivety about people who think that even if technology were available, they could sort of freeze themselves and then be defrosted so that they could live for eternity. The problem is that, the folks who freeze them might go out of business, so there could be a civil war or, God knows what. So it's always important that the core constitutive tensions and conflicts in politics aren't things that technology can solve, but technology can solve many other problems we face. Jason is saying, my apologies, Russia has lost the war in Ukraine. They have demonstrated they're incapable of conquering a third, well, it's a bit rude, isn't it? A third world country like Ukraine. Um, why should the US not make peace with Russia? The US is obviously dominant comparatively. Well, at the moment, the US is not dominant over who controls security arrangements in Eastern Europe. At the moment, the Russians and the Chinese are coming on top of the Americans in terms of who controls security arrangements in Eastern Europe. I suppose the core of the conversation, right, that might happen, Jason, around your question is actually in the chat I did yesterday, and that is, what do you think the Russians are doing there? If you think that this is a local war, kind of a squabble on the ex-Soviet space between two ex-Soviet countries, then you can sort of let it go and say, fine, we're going to stay out of it. But if this is a Russian project driven by various reasons of mystical escalation and also regime security considerations to acquire a degree of propriety over Eastern Europe or to dissolve NATO, then this sort of directly affects the United States. And then the question is, well, who's winning, who's losing? At the moment, we are losing because it looks like the Russians, the Chinese are going to have a good say over security arrangements in a part of Europe. What the Trump administration would want to say in response, and here it's not Trump speaking because he doesn't have a coherent strategic vision, it's other people speaking, is we're going to focus on China. And that means that if Ukraine's going to get taken care of, it has to be taken care of by Europe. The problem with that is that feeding Ukraine to Russia partially is not going to put the United States in a particularly strong position in handling China, Taiwan. So that's the beginning of a conversation about your question. Thank you for asking it. Thank you for your contribution. It depends on what you think the war is, what it's about, right? And how you think it is going to impact security arrangements in Europe, and then how you think security arrangements in Europe are going to impact security arrangements across the globe that the United States is interested in. So that's the structure. Whether Russia's won, whether Russia's lost, that can be a subjective framing. But one way to frame it would be that both Russia and Ukraine are losing, but Russia is losing more slowly, with more capacity, with more mobilization, with more gear of various kinds, with more domestic stability because it's not a democracy and the regime looks fairly stable now, and so on. So if we talk about Russia losing in that way, then the question also arises about Ukraine and us losing. We could say we're all losing, So that's some of the sort of big sort of map of where we'd need to go. Ryan, if Putin were forcibly removed from power, which individuals or group would have to initiate that move, and what would be the risks both for them and for Russia as a whole? So, Ryan, I think that the only way that would happen is if there is a combination of a crack in the regime at the top and some degree of commotion and politicization in the population, maybe spurred on by some figures of leadership driving it, not necessarily the Russian opposition, not necessarily liberal figures. So it would be typically both a bottom up and a top down constellation. Um, who in particular would do it is a very difficult question, because history doesn't work like that. It's not that there are individuals who are set up to do this. It's that circumstances arise and people who aren't set up to do this become people who are set up to do this, you know? Um, that's how it typically works. Circumstances make people here more often than not, rather than people making circumstances. So once certain social conditions are in place, like politicization in the population, a crack in the regime, then people who are loyalists could then move and become disloyal. What I don't believe is going around Putin's little entourage and his circles around him and saying, well, it's going to be, that person or this person who could drive it. I think that's a kind of an historical misunderstanding, because roles play people when countries approach revolutionary predicaments. Nicholas, would you agree that the enemy of the current US administration is not autocracies, but democratic and social institutions? The EU more than Russia or China? Thank you. I think that the United States is certainly against, if not individual European states, it's against Europe as a collective entity. As you know, my argument is that's a very bad idea for the United States, because the United States is stronger with its allies. So what we are seeing is an impulsive, reckless, rather unthought out transactional politics conducted on so many fronts that it's going to prove self-defeating for the Trump administration. But I wouldn't quite say that they are an enemy. I would of the Europe, not at all. I would say that they are in a sort of a cacophonous relationship of frenemies, which is my favorite term, which is that you are a friend in certain connections and an enemy in other connections. What fundamentally the United States is doing is saying, look, the alliances we have had so far no longer matter. We're going to apply sort of recent standards of convenience, and according to that, we will judge how we proceed. The problem with that approach is that you can only get away with it once, because once you stop being predictable, your involvement in many countries, right, political, economic, and military, is going to be something that these countries begin to hedge against, right? So the Canadians right now, even if Trump sort of goes back on much of his Canada talk and action, the Canadians are never going to feel safe anymore with their southern neighbor, so it's a sort of exploitative move. You can only play once on your allies. You can't play it twice, because once you play it, they're going to realize that you're not a reliable pillar to lean on in the global scene. But no, it's not enemies. It's sort of fleeting dynamics of friendship and competition and enemyship that is sort of cacophonously carouseling itself around in the way the Trump administration conducts itself. Do you think Finland is safe? Is there a chance it'll be thrown under the bus? By the way, I grew up in Adelaide myself. Nice to hear you visited. I spent a lot of time, I would even say, living in Adelaide. Jim, I would say Article 5 is gone, largely. But when we talk about a conflict between Russia and NATO, we're not talking about a full-scale conflict. We're talking about a low threshold challenge of Article 5 by Putin. So that's kind of the worst case scenario for the Baltics, potentially for Finland. Um, not full scale Russian invasion. However, why would the Russians need to collapse Article 5 if it's collapsing by itself? Is here an interesting thought. And to then pass this out further, we'd need to then fall back on the way the Russians are currently motivated. Like, in what ways are they driven for further escalation? Is it to do with regime security exclusively? Do they still maintain some kind of project of mystically motivated escalation against the West, or do they think that's unnecessary because the West is dissolving? And so that's how that conversation carries on. Haganate. Hi, Vlad. Thank you for your work. Instead of Putin potentially invading the Baltics, or Moldova, could he invade a country like Georgia or Kazakhstan? Well, I don't think we're talking about full invasion. And I think that certainly the arrangement with Georgia as it currently stands suits Mr. Putin. But I would say that of all the countries mentioned, Moldova is particularly vulnerable to Russian misdemeanor. Zonko, Vlad, you frame immigration as a consent challenge needing better explanation. Isn't that gaslighting? Citizens understand but reject cultural transformation. What's your answer to those wanting society to stay recognizable? My answer is that they have a responsible position on the doorstep, and we can't just tell them to wise up and say, you know what, economic efficiency tells us that to run our public services, we need to bring in 800,000 people a year into the UK. And if you feel comfortable with 300,000, you're irrational and ignorant and racist. That's what we can't do. We need a kind of a reversal of the way we relate to civic consent. We persuade people about an immigration policy we believe is right, and then do it, rather than do it and then persuade people that it's right. Getting immigration wrong can just collapse Western democracies into becoming Hungary over the next 10, 15 years. So that balance is incredibly precious. We'll talk about it before. And I did a talk about it on the chat channel, to which presumably I think you are reacting, which was itself a reaction to Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell discussing it. What would John McCain say? Well, John McCain would be a very standard, hawkish, constitutional Republican, being a very firm supporter of Ukraine and saying that Trump is absolutely nuts and that people like Marco Rubio are grifters to go along with that. TK McClone, could you talk about the threat of political violence in the United States? The more Trump tries to rule with revenge and with authoritarian turns, the more Trump tries to grind down US democratic institutions, counter majoritarian institutions, the closer the United States will shift towards civil war. So that's the way to think about it. The more post-truth authoritarians try to dismantle US democracy, the more polarization about that will unleash out onto the streets. That's just one remark among many. You're asking an incredibly important question. For all of the terribleness going on now, we can say that the Democrats accepted Trump's victory as legitimate on the whole, even though they have disappeared as a meaningful political voice, which is utterly extraordinary. It's even sort of a competitor in terms of extraordinariness for the recklessness of the Trump administration. The silence of the Democrats is just as a remarkable political phenomenon. Robotic person, the Canadians will never forgive. Look, a lot of the tricks that Trump's trying to pull off on allies, you can only do it once, right? I mean, if you are sort of in my house and you're helping me oversee my, this is Rory Stewart's analogy, my electricity bills, if you're funding my children's attendance of schools or whatever, and then you suddenly say, you know what, I'm going to extort you for, a lot of money. I'm stumped because, I have outsourced all of that stuff to you and I have these close relationships with you. But I'm not going to let you run my electricity bills, utilities again. I'm not going to let you oversee my children's education again, and so on. So you can only pull the trick once. Dragos, thank you for all the work. How do you deal with friends stuck in a post-truth bubble? So um, I don't have friends stuck in a post-truth bubble, unfortunately. Um, but I understand a lot of people do. And I think it's very difficult to deal with. And I do divide people who voted for Trump into two: people who are sort of really off with the fairies into a magical thinking about the world. Now, you have to say that's not an intellectual failure. It's a sort of, you know, a mechanism whereby you destroy the world in your mind because it's difficult to deal with and bear. But then there are also Trump voters who aren't that gone. They're just feeling that they wanted to send up the Democrat and they wanted to shake up and so on. So these people are much easier to deal with. A lot of my colleagues on YouTube, unfortunately, endorsed Trump. I don't know, Konstantin Kissin from Trigonometry endorsed Trump, for example. Now, a fascinating question arose today on Twitter is, can I imagine a public intellectual responsibly endorsing Trump? And that arose because I responded to Neil Ferguson's tweet about how he thinks that Trump is engaged in a certain kind of Nixonian strategy in how he's trying to interact with the Russians, the Chinese. And I said, look, Trump doesn't have much of a strategy because the guy has a narcissistic personality disorder. He has impulsivity problems. He has dispositional states instead of belief. So it's an aspirational historical analogy, but the reality is that Trump doesn't have a strategy. Now, Neil kind of endorsed Trump. I imagine it's conceivable for me that a public intellectual could responsibly endorse Trump, but it's very difficult to imagine in practice. I would say that it would have to be sort of a destructive endorsement. It would be a public intellectual who says, we need some kind of political collapse. Otherwise, everything is going to be even worse without it. And that's why you vote for Trump. What I'm not really open to recognizing is voting for Trump as a constructive political project, which is how Neil endorsed Trump. So I think I'm not saying Neil is an irresponsible public thinker and public historian, but Neil's endorsement is irresponsible, right? Because it's just a nutty mechanism. The mechanism won't deliver anything. So just the same way, Konstantin Kissin's endorsement of Trump as a YouTube commentator is irresponsible, right? Um, that doesn't mean I couldn't conceivably imagine a responsible endorsement of Trump by a YouTuber or by a public intellectual. But it would need to be very special circumstances because this is such a transparently destructive project, whatever aspirations you have for America, no matter how disastrous you think Kamala Harris would have been. Not responsible does not mean wanting to silence people or cancel people, for goodness sake. Don't think there's any equation there. Hi, Vlad. I think it's irresponsible to say that the odds of political violence increase with polarization. Trump would love nothing more than an excuse for martial law, Gilligan says. So it's almost like we're going back to the thing about whether it's okay to talk about Zelensky, how he could have handled the Oval Office differently. Yes, of course it's okay. And yes, of course it's okay to talk about this. I am exploring possibilities. Why on earth wouldn't I answer a good question from a thoughtful person about what risks there are? The, the point is that and there are 6 likes there, and you're all delusional. And you're all delusional because, funnily enough, open, truthful, robust discourse is itself an important counter-majoritarian institution. Whether it's in the form of expertise or in the form of academic expertise. Democracy depends on that, right? So when you're saying don't say the thing that's true because it's not convenient, you're actually pushing against, right, the tethering of democracy to truthfulness, which is the only way it survives. So, funnily enough, it's not just that you're asking me to be untruthful, it's that the practical import of your request, if implemented, would undermine democracy more. Obviously, we're talking about like drops in the ocean here. I mean, you know, let's be realistic. We're 1,500 people here. So, whatever you or I say, we're doing drops in the ocean. But what you've said is more damaging to democracy, not just less true, but it's actually more damaging to democracy than talking about this freely and openly. So grasp that. Now there are only 5 likes from 6. Somebody was guilted. I'm sorry, I'm being mean. I guilted somebody out of like to Gilligan's comment. You can like it back again if you like. I'm sorry to be a bully, but it's very important, right? That we are open about the discourse we have and the way that democracy is actually tethered to truthfulness. I don't believe democracy survives if too many people in public discourse are going around saying untruthful things. And we're there now already. We're at risk because too many people are saying untruthful things regularly in public with no consequences. So unfortunately, my causal analysis is the opposite. It's actually that you're making a request that's counterproductive for the very thing you want to avoid. In other words, me speaking about it, if anything, reduces the chances of violence because it engages people in a constructive way about their politics. It's a way of us talking to each other. We're not all in the United States, but we're all citizens trying to be responsible in our countries. So sorry to push back on the causation there, let alone on the truthfulness. And I can just say maybe you can forgive my extreme meanness about this. Maybe you can't, but that's the way I see it. Russia has repeatedly and brazenly, Michael is saying, violated international conventions on human conduct. What is an appropriate response to increasing violations? I mean, you're clutching at thin air here. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to put Putin in The Hague? What are you going to do? Look at what Israel has done in response to the barbarism of October 7th. What are you going to do? So we're living through a difficult meltdown of the post-World War II revolution in international jurisprudence, and it's a world where unfortunately these things they've always had limited friction. When they've come into friction with big power, they haven't been, efficacious. But now they have even less friction, I'm afraid. Which is difficult, but we have to be sort of straight at calling out how much this sort of international jurisprudential post-World War II infrastructure has melted down or not. One more thing, Trump will extend his term. He'll try to. One more thing says he has no scruples. There are 2 years. They're 2 years out from election cycle, so bury your heads in the meantime. Well, no need to bury your heads. Trump's attempt to stay in office in 2028 is much more likely to fail than succeed if he makes it. And my sort of freaking out barometer for US citizens is the biggest alarm is still the Trumps to come in the 2030s. They'll genuinely have a really strong chance of nailing the democracy. It's going to be difficult for Trump to end US democracy. And it's going to be difficult for Vance to do it if Vance follows Trump. But we're getting there into the 2030s where there is going to be more concerted action by more disciplined political actors. Whereas Trump is, he's doing a bad job of undermining US democracy while doing a lot of damage because he's unlike Orban, not hard-nosed and so on. So we've got an age of post-truth authoritarian populists who are buffoons, and we're going to move into an age in the 2030s of post-truth authoritarian populists who are disciplined and hard-nosed political actors. Stephen B sort of agreeing with me that we shouldn't consider too much the political consequences of speech. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, and there's a terrible tendency in liberal circles to do this sort of speech contraction, and that's partly led to Trump too. Okay, I'm gonna snap back to the general chat now, having done some super chats. Jaggy Snake, do we think Vance is just going along for the ride, hoping Trump doesn't make it to 2028, or hoping to replace Trump in 2028? So Vance is insecure, but ambitious, calculated. Let me throw a big bone to the. It's actually not a bone. I'm just being silly to the people who freaked out at me deconstructing Zelensky's performance. Vance's intervention was pretty calculated in the White House, and what we're going to learn from my um, narcissism video on the main channel, which comes an eternity from now because of my health crisis, but the scriptification of it is mostly done now, and I'm impressed with it. I think it's going to be good. It's going to be the first non-BS discussion of the interaction of Trump's personality issues with his politics. Because all too often what we get, I'm not forgetting the comment, all too often what we get is, oh, Trump slurred his speech and he looked erratic and he's in cognitive decline. My colleague David Pacman does a lot of episodes like that, which always conclude with, we don't know what's going on, but Trump is certainly not performing well here, and then 500,000 views and then repeat the next day. In reality, what we need is a clear link. Like, what is it about Trump that's making him submit to Putin? But what Vance did in that moment is manipulate Trump's narcissism by realizing that Trump was getting no narcissistic supply from Zelensky, because Zelensky isn't an idealized figure for Trump. So he's just a nobody, doesn't exist. He's a kind of a speck. And then Vance hit on gratitude and respect, the two things that Trump was being unfulfilled on in the conversation, and then facilitated Trump to begin getting narcissistic supply via the interaction with Zelensky, in the form of a kind of a theater of sadistic cruelty, which allowed Trump to say, look how omnipotently destructive I am. I can, be in charge of the miseries of other humans, even if they're leaders of states. Slimsky saying, doesn't authoritarianism always need limits on speech and behavior enforced by a large state apparatus to work? No, because you can have enough enclaves of free speech, actually, but if your courts are muzzled, and if your elections are tilted to not be fair, you could actually be just grinding in the mud. You could be going around with quite a bit of free speech in your society, but if enough other institutions are muzzled, you can be in trouble, right? You can have a modicum of free speech, but still feel that you're stuck and you can't fully challenge the people in power. So it's an important component, but it's not the only way to do this. When you say that Musk's multiplanetary RSH is asking species idea is an unrealizable utopia, do you mean that we will never be a multiplanetary species, or that we will, but it involve the same iniquities we see on Earth? So in the short term, I mean that it's going to be practically undoable. But in the longer term, I'm saying that one thing we can definitely be sure is that it won't allow us to transcend, right, any of the fragilities of organized life here on Earth. And then in the end won't actually be a meaningful solution to the sustenance of the human race. And then in the end also won't be a very healthy kind of enterprise either. Um, um, because we can't actually secure ourselves against the fragility, and tragic prospect of disappearance as a species, in my view. But what I'm going to do, because my brain's a bit fuzzy at the moment, is recall that quite a few people are asking this. I'm going to do a proper episode where I'll actually give a meaningful answer. This is a bit of a garbled, all over the place response for today, and I apologize. What can we do? MG is saying to slow down or reverse this trajectory. I presume the trajectory of democratic decline and international calamity. Well, in the United States, one thing you need is the Democrats to wake the hell up and offer not just a rigorous challenge to Trump, but a challenge backed by a vision for America that is based on economic democratization, that is non woke, that speaks to the whole country, and is seriously preoccupied with the issue of depolarizing us. Thimble, glad that you've caught alive. So, and then we need local politics to complement national politics. Melinda, thank you so much. You are appreciated too. We need a rejuvenation of people's capacity to touch politics and feel, oh, it's real. Oh, it's a real thing. I shouldn't just think it's something that doesn't make sense and throw it out of the window. Glenn is saying, if you could magically remove either Trump or Putin from power, who would you choose? Wow. Well, what would happen? Who would take over? Would we have what? Somebody from Putin's inner circle taking over and JD Vance taking over? Then it's not very pointful. I'd remove. I'd remove both. I'm sorry, I don't know how to do this. I'd remove both. The woke fools are responsible for all of this. No. Hyper-identity politics, liberal hyper-identity politics, which said, let's treat political disagreement as core moral disagreement. Let's treat core moral disagreement as all about identity, and let's impose this identity on institutions. That has made the situation worse. But it's not the cause of all of this. It's just one contributing factor, one of 5 or 7. Kathleen is saying, I wrote in Bernie's name for president several times. Big mistake to run Hillary. So I am not a big, huge Bernie fan in the sense that if Bernie had won, and I do believe Bernie could have beaten Trump, Bernie would have been able to do so little of what he had promised. It would have itself been a kind of a moment of dejection for Democrats and for Democrats to the left of the party and for people to the left of anything that the Democrats are. So there would have been a lot of pain there, a lot of disillusionment. But what Bernie is a guy who understands the importance of inequality and the need for economic empowerment and economic democratization. And Bernie is also an inclusive populist. That's to say, you could disagree with Bernie's vision and politics, but what you can't say is that Bernie is exclusionary. He doesn't think that some citizens count more than others. Whereas Trump is an exclusionary populist. Trump thinks that some Americans are in, but others can be deprioritized. Let's have a look. Melinda is saying, I've always had my doubts about Neil Ferguson. Any intellectual hands up being for Trump may not deserve the term. Look, he deserves the term. He is a beautiful writer. He's written some fantastic books. Cash Nexus is a book from 2001, 2002 that's still a wonderful anti-neoliberal tract in the 21st century. But the particular decision to endorse Trump as a potentially constructive candidate is risible in my view. Sorry, Neil, just risible. What do I think about TikTok-like approach to media clickbaiting, for example? How does it affect society? So I have paradoxical views. I am actually a big fan in a crisis of trust of politicians over communicating. So if a politician came to me and said, Vlad, should I go and do an Instagram vertical video once a day? I would say yes. I would tell um, everyone in the Democratic Party to do that right now. I would tell my Prime Minister Keir Starmer to do that right now. Um, on the one hand. On the other hand, I do think we are facing some cataclysmic epistemic problems as a result of um, both what you talk about, which is the nature of um, rapid short form content, and algorithmic bubbles. I do think that we are facing a real comprehension crisis. I do think we have got really bad at comprehension. So we really are in a situation where if I sit here and say on the global internet that I have a problem with my 2 liter water bottle, I'd like it to be even bigger. There will be people saying, why do you criticize your water bottle? You know, it's made of glass. It's better for the climate than plastic. And it's like, whoever suggested that I'm denying that? So is this a sense of not being able to keep two things in mind at the same time that we really suffer from really, really badly? And I do think, I'm afraid, what happened, I was discussing this with a public philosopher friend from Denmark, with some of the stuff around don't talk about Zelensky, handling his Oval Office ambush better. Some of that was really kind of like a neon sign reaction. I'm traveling down the street. I'm looking out for neon signs which say negative Zelensky comment, and then I'm seeing boom, negative Zelensky comment. Let's clamp that down. But context, right? Context. So we're very, very awful at comprehension, and there is a risk of sort of being nostalgic about the past, and I'm afraid that ain't the case. 20 years ago, most people had much, much better comprehension. We really struggle now to read 3 sentences, go away, and actually say what they said. And what's even more worrying is that some of the most intelligent people struggle like that. So it's not because we've become dumb, it's because we have stopped thinking freely. Now, you see, you can think unfreely in a very elaborate way, right? I grew up in the Soviet Union, so I could have recited a very complex, unfree justification of the Soviet system. I could have been incredibly intelligent in how I'd elaborated my arguments, but I wouldn't have been thinking freely. And so we really, really struggle with this. And I see this a lot, even in our community. We encounter something, and before we get to the stage of whether we want to sort of give it a thumbs up or poo-poo it, we try to reconstruct it, and then we can't. And then we look, and then it turns out that we've actually got like 2 master's degrees and we're quite smart. But we look at 3 sentences, we can't reconstruct what's in them because we're looking for surface signals. And we're reacting to surface signals with other signals that we know are supposed to be generated by us when we encounter certain particular signals. You know, we're just used to, when we're traveling past a beetroot, that we've got to put up a turnip. And that's it, beetroot turnip, beetroot turnip. And we are behaving algorithmically here in a bot like way. So we have a huge crisis of comprehension. And don't forget, democracy is not just voting in elections. Democracy is our capacity to have a collective conversation together. So we're experiencing a huge decline at the level of our capacity to have a collective conversation together. Hang on, I've got a phone call coming through. The rant alert police. Yes, I plead guilty. I did one. I don't know, must have been like 15 minutes I was going on. I'm sorry. I'm going to pay the fine. Thanks for letting me know. Sorry about that, beautiful community. Clearly, I got in trouble. And it's comical, right? I mean, literally, most of us are vulnerable to this. We see like a constellation of two words in a text, and boom, we begin react to it, even when it actually is predicated on misinterpretation of what's there. So that's really scary because it kind of means we can't talk properly. I mean, think about how primitive humans elaborated the concept of truthfulness for the first time, right? It was to do with um, an elementary need for a distribution of labor, right? Ricky needs to go to the river. Ricky needs to look at the river. We can't all go to the river. Ricky looks at the river, sees if there are fish at the river, and comes back and talks to us about it, right? Um, and our survival is depending on this sort of distribution of labor and the capacity for truthful messages to be communicated. Otherwise, we're not going to have the fish from the river. But if Ricky goes to the river and he says that the leaves are, red on a tree by the river, and we just have an inability to react calmly when the word red is mentioned, we we could screw up our livelihood. Ricky, have you gone to the river? Yeah. Let me tell you about the fish, but first I saw the red tree. Did he say red tree? How dare he say the word red? Unbelievable. What a disgrace. Unbelievable. And then Ricky wanders off, and then we don't even know about the fish, and then we have no food. So this is quite important stuff. The concept of truthfulness arose in elementary, uh, um, early human social conditions around basic need for distribution of labor. That's how basic that concept is, and we're undermining our capacity to connect with ourselves in a way that is conducive to truthfulness. So, beautiful community. Let's try to take maybe a foreign policy question. Let me have a look. Oxygen, beautiful community. I am on oxygen half of the day. What am I inhaling? Microvascular and heart damage from since August, post COVID. Jacob is asking, Jacob Costa Correa is asking, Vlad, to what extent do you think this issue, presumably what I'm ranting about now, stems from education trying to keep up with progress in technology and science, ultimately making us get a weaker grasp of the underlying mechanisms? I'm at risk of not understanding the question completely, but let me try. So I do think we need more education around how to negotiate this informational environment as efficacious citizens. And one of the things, if I stop having so many silly health crises, I want to do is focus on that both in some videos and actually in some dedicated workshops. We're kind of left to our own devices about how to negotiate this in a politically constructive way. And that's why so many of us are super smart and we still behave unconstructively online. Um, so I think we need very significant education about how to handle the kind of information space we live in, especially if we're not going to make any more progress with making the spaces more accountable or more democratic or better regulated. Um, so we need some significant resources because this is the core of our political life, but yet we still treat it as entertainment. Yes, it's fantastic to see like micro pigs and stuff. I saw an amazing micro pig. Actually, reminded me of one of my non-micro pigs, just a small pig of mine that ran away called Ruby in Tonga because I failed to pig-proof my fence, and he got murdered by dogs. um, unfortunately. And then my other pig didn't run away. Um, but that's not what this is. This is not really cute, amazing brown pig with a white spot stuff. This is politics. And so there's a risk that this is actually really serious stuff. But we still don't think of it in as serious a way as we should. I mean, that's why I am in a very lame way trying to do better with this, right? I'm trying to be, obviously we can make jokes here, but I'm trying to be responsible, not serious, but responsible in the way we do this. Because I think that we've got to wake up to the realization that the way we're handling this technology is really not good at the moment. I mean, it's really not good. And I do think that we need um, institutionalization of education around how to handle this. Sure, that's just a small part of the answer to your question. I apologize. Stage, are you familiar with Sabine Hossenfelder? Many people think she's undergoing right-wing algorithm capture. I'm inclined to think she's actually just pointing out very real problems in academia. She looks neurodiverse to me. I think she knows that, even though she doesn't have a formal diagnosis, she knows that. I can't say because I have not watched her videos in months and months. I'm inclined to be protective of her, but I haven't watched. I'm sure I will, and then we could talk. So I just can't make a comment at the moment. But you're right in principle to worry about algorithmic drift everywhere. Notice part of my pushback against don't talk about Zelensky's Altner handling of the ambush he suffered in the Oval Office, that's me pushing back against algorithm capture. Do you realize that? Because there's a minority of the community doesn't want me to speak about things in a particular way. And I'm a freak though, right? I'm happy to lose 90% of you if that means not compromising. But that's freaky, that's weird. You're quite frankly virtually not going to find that anywhere online today. So we have these difficult incentives, and we all, with all of the commentators we watch, we should look after that issue. We should always keep sort of analyzing it, and with compassion, not just you're beginning to drift algorithmically, you disgraceful grifter, but you're beginning to drift a bit. Are you okay? Can we throw you a little lifeline here? Maybe pull you back in a bit, right? So I want to be compassionate to you, the audience, when you get algorithm captured. I want you to be compassionate, not to me, but to other creators when they begin to drift. If compassion is appropriate and constructive, to get them back a little bit. YouTube channel for all. You do compromise. You avoid talking about the Middle East. You even say so yourself. So I'm planning to talk about the Middle East again. I did 10 videos about it. I talk about it clearly, right? I condemn I condemn the barbarism of October 7th unequivocally, unlike some. And I also condemned Israel's response. And I talked about dynamics outside of the Green Line in terms of colonial occupation, military rule, and apartheid. I broke a record. I lost 1,000 subscribers in 5 hours on the main channel while talking about this on the live. I'm going to be losing more subscribers when I talk about it next. My policy to talk about this issue is different, though. It's actually not to tell you what I think, but because it's so extreme, it's so hot, and it generates so much acting out straight away in the community, that the way I would talk about it is literally spend 5-10 minutes grounding us and then going boom, 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 boom. But let's be clear. I mean, I spoke to a creator in an algorithmic proximity to me with big, very big numbers, some of the biggest, toward 1 million subs, and they really um, had a very bad experience trying to speak about this and had to pedal back for their own well-being, in fact, mental health and so on, because you immediately get bombarded with threats, physical threats, on all sides. But I have talked about, it's about 10 videos from that autumn where it all began. And I'll be talking about it again. So I think on balanced, I'm proud of my handling of it, and will continue to be proud. And I owe you soon a chat about it, because, like, where are we? How do we balance everything? It's really important for us to talk about, and I'll deliver it. And there has been, I mean, half of my story is niched. It has been toward Russia analysis, right, from a public intellectual point of view, and then the other half is just global political dynamics, and especially our precious democracies and our democratic culture. So yeah, I think that that's how I see that. Orion, upon seeing the European reaction to Zelensky's Trump meeting, I felt a little more hopeful for our continent. I felt quite proud of Merz, Macron, Tusk, Ursula. Is this just naivety? Look, here is my sense from talking to people who are talking to people about what people in the corridors of power in Europe are feeling now. A lot of people are feeling like they are trying to act fast, like they're doing the right thing. But there's also a background sense of doom, almost like you're part of a world that's drifting away and you're consigned to be the bit that drifts away. This is how a lot of centrist technocratic European elites are feeling. There's a kind of a quiet dread that history is consigning you to the dustbin a bit. So that's felt in European corridors of power, that threat, that discombobulation. Because all you need is just 2-3 Trumps in France, Germany, UK, and the story is cooked. Then the other thing I would alert Orion as to is notice what the Europeans are doing at the moment. They are doing a few moves toward Europe taking European security more seriously. But the primary enterprise they're still engaged in is trying to get Ukraine American security guarantees. I think that's a failing enterprise. I think they know it's a failing enterprise, but they're trying, and it's hard, but they're trying. But it's a sort of a 1% shot, because the Americans don't want it and the Russians wouldn't allow it. But that's what the Europeans are trying. So it's difficult. It's a difficult predicament. It's like trying to do something that you know is basically going to fail. So that's a little bit of a souring on the sort of, feast of pride in what we're doing here that you're gently proposing. So it's difficult. It's really difficult stuff. The best realistic thing we can get is Europe doing a disproportionate amount to arm Ukraine very significantly on the Ukraine issue. But yeah, they're still, rather than decoupling from the United States, what all of these figures you've mentioned are trying primarily is to rebridge Ukraine with the United States, which is a difficult task. RSH, my grandmother and me also both had severe ADHD because it's genetic, absolutely. My compassion, I hope you have some superpowers with it, but I also know it's hard. Has Putin's chances of not surviving the war increased? Reggie is asking. Well, the problem is that the war, in one capacity or another, may not stop as long as Putin is there. So it's kind of a difficult way of, you know, framing it. In some version, if you think of it as a wider war against the West, the war will always be there with Putin there. Let's have a look. Neil is proud. Yeah, I was seriously having some air hunger issues about half an hour in. I'm doing a bit better now. I hid them 95% well, but it was getting edgy. I almost had to stop. So we're really powering through here, beautiful community. KP, I don't even know what the main channel is. It's got more subscribers than this. It's got more polished videos than this, and I hope it's gonna have more it's gonna have more regular videos soon. But just Google search on YouTube Vlad Wexler, the channel, not Vlad Wexler chat. Claire Jones, thank you. Evgeny is asking a question about Syria. Well, we might talk about it separately. So let me just make a generic comment of a kind of educational kind about humans and collapsed states. So some of the worst things on earth are tyrannies of the kind that seem with Saddam or Assad. But certain kinds of failed states can be as bad or differently bad or worse. So what we can say is a toppled tyranny means things can go better. There is an opportunity to go better. And that's the way I would look at the Assad collapse. You try to make use of the opportunity. So it's a more proactive view than, just one that says, is Assad better than, years and years of horrendous things happening on that space without a dictatorship of that kind? The answer is, when a dictatorship collapses, you just try to take advantage of the opportunity as much as possible. It's really difficult in that extremely multi-agent context, multiple agents with multiple influences from different parts of the region. What I would say is that there's no necessary connection between an absolutely unbearably ghastly regime collapsing and things getting better, because sort of a Hobbesian predicament of war of all against all could be worse than the worst tyranny. But the thing is, when the tyranny collapses, there is an opportunity to do more. So I would see it aspirationally like this, but I also recognize we have often had this naive idea that things will just go better once you topple the tyranny. One of the big mistakes the West made in Iraq is thinking that you can destroy the Saddam regime without destroying the state. So we've had many, many illusions of various kinds about hunky-dory consequences of collapsing tyrants. Look at the US policy on Russia. They are worried about some kind of internal collapse in Russia, and they've really wanted to avoid it. That's part of the reason also why Ukraine didn't get as much help as it could have done. So we always need to be sober about that dynamic of sort of a Hobbesian nightmare versus the nightmare of the most pernicious, tyrannical dictatorship. And there is no sort of automatic clear answers there. We'll take ourselves to 1.5 hours, so we'll do 10 minutes more. what are my thoughts on the 2028 elections being fair in the United States? My thoughts are that Trump needs to be hit back with challenge from different counter-majoritarian institutions. But as things stand, America is heading towards being in a position to vote Trump out in 2028. So that's where we're heading, towards a functional democratic election. We can't take anything for granted, and it may require work to secure it. But I don't think United States is heading for an end of democracy in 2028. It's heading for being a more illiberal democracy with fewer levers to pull to get people out of power. But there'll be enough competitive pluralism in the system, the way we're drifting now, for there to be meaningful elections in 2028. But we need to watch this and keep analyzing it, because nothing is guaranteed. Relative time works. Always so good to see you. Thanking me for my sensibility and thanking you for your presence. Astro Gremlin is saying, let's assume any American security guarantee. It's only good for 4 years due to a crazy system. And also, it's just not good at all. I mean, imagine Trump gave a security guarantee on a Tuesday and then took it back on a Thursday. Even if Trump were to give a security guarantee to Ukraine via being a backstop to European troops on the ground, it could just vanish overnight with Trump. That's the degree of unpredictability in the system we are dealing with. So Mario is asking about my thoughts on Peter Turchin's elite overproduction hypothesis. I think it explains wokeness and neoliberal failures, but not far-right populism. Certainly with hyper-identity politics, there were two elements there which deformed sound liberal values like social justice and inclusiveness. And that was a deformed notion of authenticity, of self-realization. And second, it was careerist competitiveness, power dynamics in acquisition of career advantage. A lot of the hyper-identity politics discourse was that. It was people in institutions like the academy trying to get on top of others, get an advantage by being more anti-colonial than the other person, for example, right? So there's a lot of that. It's sort of an elite fighting for micro advantage among itself, while actually disregarding genuine disadvantage that Black Americans feel, disregarding genuine structural disadvantages many minorities feel in the United States, genuinely fighting for the rights of different sexual minorities. So, yes, I think this sort of careerist sociology is important there. Philip D. Mayer, Vlad, you're Russian. When you're going to take us over? So psychologically, I'm not Russian, right? If you put me in a group of Russians, they will feel that like an alien is among them. Like the mouth opens and the language can come out. Probably with less of an accent than in English, but still a tiny accent if you can hear it. I can't speak a single language perfectly. I much prefer speaking English and myself in English, but they would feel like they're with an alien. They'd feel less with something very culturally distant from them. That's what they feel. That's but a paradox with some of the very rare zings I get from the pro-Ukrainian internet, which I normally get 98% love for. Big love, strong love. People say, oh, you only think, some people said you only criticize Zelensky a bit because you're Russian. There's somebody with like 200,000 subscribers on YouTube left a comment and said, Vlad, you only criticize Zelensky because you're Russian. By the way, do get better with your health. So it's like a well-meaning comment. And it's just so absurd because, of course, if you take a fairly pro-Western West Ukrainian, different to East Ukrainians, they are different to Russians. They're freer. They have a different political mythology to Russians. but they're culturally much closer to Russians than I am. That's the paradox of that argument, right? Obviously, I'm at a greater cultural distance from Ukrainians than Ukrainians are from Russians, right? That's not the Putin propaganda, they're the same thing message. They're not the same thing. They're very much not the same thing. But there are removes of cultural proximity, right? So that's the paradox, that the argument is so bad that it leads you to the conclusion of having to make the argument that Ukrainians are Russians, which is a catastrophic argument to make. But Ukrainians are of greater cultural proximity to Russians than I am. So that's the point. But then somebody might say, well, hang on, no, it's not psychology then. It's not that you feel Central European, West European, just with a small, very small Russian twang. It's your ethnicity, which is obviously a fashy move. But if that's the case, I'm more Polish and Ukrainian than I'm Russian. So take that. Oh, by the way, I was born with a Ukrainian surname. I'm Vlad Goncharenko. Now, did you know that I'm Vlad Goncharenko? And I changed the Vexler as the family moved to Israel. So there we go. Now, beautiful community, let's take maybe one last question. Do I think that J.D. Vance is executing Curtis Yarvin's ideas? So I think this is a very serious question, unfortunately. I think that behind Trump himself, there's a lot of ideology driving a lot of what's being done. It's very serious and it needs to be talked about. I don't think it's as simple as, Yarvin's ideas being implemented, but I think that Yarvin's ideas are in the same cultural wash as some of the ideas that are driving some of the policies that I think, some of the politics I think is very destructive. So I think we've got to take this very, very seriously. We'll talk about it, and I'm going to probably talk about Yarvin at some point in a more elaborate way. I've just given you snippets so far. I keep being invited to a pod. For health reasons, I haven't gone, where Yarvin often appears. I don't know, I might even end up having a skirmish with him. So, really serious question. Do not underestimate the ideological undercurrents of some of the stuff this administration is doing, just because Trump is himself not involved with ideology, because he doesn't have many beliefs. Trump has about 4 to 7 beliefs that have stuck with him all his life, like his tariffs stories from at least the 80s. But apart from those 4 to 7 beliefs, he doesn't have beliefs. He just has dispositional states that float around. But don't underestimate the ideological determination of some actors behind Trump. And I would even say that Musk is, for all of his sort of abstract delineation of things from first principles, Musk himself is hugely ideological. Hugely ideological. He would just say, come on, man, it's common sense. No, Musk is hugely ideological. Musk holds some pretty significant ideological weight, scientifically, from a techno-utopian point of view, from a neoliberal point of view, from a hyper-neoliberal point of view. Competition and the strongest just grabs what they want. So we'll talk about that ideology. It often gets dismissed because Trump is so narcissistically transactional, but we've got to take it seriously. Beautiful community, my love for you and your love for me pulled me through about halfway through this chat. I've never had a sort of a do I need to stop moment before, and that shows the kind of quality we've got here, beautiful community. It shows the kind of quality we've got. So lots of love, and we're going to talk soon. and I'll see you on the main channel soonishly, and on chat as always regularly. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Lots of love, 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 love.